not to revisit those arguments, but to take a closer look at how our desire to understand and measure intelligence is connected to a broader range of ideas that have important, deep, technical relationships to today's online, algorithmic society. In 1869, Francis Galton drew on Catullus and wrote Hereditary Genius, where he sought to explain that human intelligence was a quantitative factor, just like the chest size of those Scottish soldiers. He further wished to show that this factor was inherited, and thus under the action of evolution. Galton was a strong believer in the evolutionary theory that descended from his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and had been made into real science by Charles Darwin, his first cousin. At the time, no one had any knowledge of the mechanisms of genetics that determine simple things like eye color, much less a complex phenomenon like intelligence. DNA was discovered in 1869, and the term, gene, was introduced in 1905, but the fact that the former was the same as the latter wouldn't be clear until Watson and Crick's discovery in 1953. Thus, in order to prove his theory, Galton absolutely required Catullus' variational reasoning, which said that the measurements of human factors must be viewed statistically, through the lens of probability, and the bell curve. Like Catullus' inference that variation from his ideal soldier was a deformity, Galton reasoned that a child's intellect was subject to deformity by a host of accidental causes. Therefore, from parents of normal intelligence, one would expect the birth of children who were also of normal intelligence with a high probability, but also the arrival of abnormal, stupid, or genius children with some probability. From genius parents, you'd expect a similar outcome, but with the intelligence of the children skewed upward in general. With less intelligent parents, the skew would be downward. Galton reasoned, based on Catullus' ideas, that the quantitative factor of intelligence had to be distributed amongst these children according to the bell curve. Thus, it was Galton that gave the bell curve its third common usage name. He called it the normal distribution. 6. This new name has powerful connotations. No longer is data simply just plotted on a curve, instead the introduction of the word normal brings with it a host of value judgments and the assumption that there is, in fact, a norm. In addition, the word distribution implies there is a quantitative scale from better to worse. Together the whole phrase, normal distribution, seems to suggest something of a natural law. Galton was also making a leap of reasoning based on CLT, a methodology that was originally based on human errors made while measuring the physical position of stars, to natural variations in a complex human phenomenon that was assumed to be a quantitative factor without, at the time, having any knowledge of the basic mechanisms of the factor at all. He wrote, "It will be remembered that these are to the effect that individual errors of observation, or individual differences in objects belonging to the same generic group, are entirely due to the aggregate action of variable influences in different combinations." He goes on to restate the assumptions of Laplace in CLT, implying the idea that the integration of many underlying errors should yield the observed bell curve of outcomes. Galton himself knew that his normal distribution was an artifact of reductionism, but the field of study he launched would find statistical means to not only ignore this fact but imply that the underlying human reality of intelligence was very simple. Galton also took another important step beyond the assumptions of Catullus, who saw the average man as ideal and deviations from this ideal as monstrous. Galton, drawing on the work of his cousin, felt that the average man could be improved, evolved, made less monstrous than the current manifestation, via morally and politically controlled evolution, that is, the promotion of the low-probability genius children to become genius parents and, inversely, the discouragement of lower intelligence people from becoming parents at all. Via this active strategy, society could move towards the evolutionary utopian goal of physical, moral and cultural perfectibility, through the birth of a new academic field and social movement, which Galton called eugenics. Galton spent the rest of his life advancing eugenic ideas as a positive force for change. He argued that social institutions such as welfare and mental asylums allowed inferior humans to survive. Their survival meant an increased chance that they could reproduce, possibly even at higher levels than their superior counterparts in the upper classes. He was not alone in his thinking. Initially, eugenics was enthusiastically embraced as a liberal, meritocratic movement, one aimed at freeing men, and to a lesser extent women, from being judged on arbitrary, superstitious grounds, particularly religious beliefs, thus facilitating the evolution of society, through meritocratic, technological interventions, towards a better world for all. It was clean math, made into scientific political action. The theory chimed perfectly with the Victorian age of enquiry, when men bestrode the world measuring, analyzing and collecting a prodigious amount of data on their new colonies. Galton himself traveled extensively through Eastern Europe to Constantinople, and to East and Southern Africa, where he carried out a surveying expedition in Namibia in 1850, which earned him the Royal Geographical Society's Founders Gold Medal in 1853. Having been a child prodigy himself, he had always been interested in intelligence and how this and other behavioral and character traits were transmitted from parents to child. And following the publication of Origin, he was the first person to attempt to systematically measure intelligence, inventing questionnaires, twin studies, the lexical approach, psychometrics, the science of measuring mental faculties, and differential psychology. At the same time, he was hugely influential in the fields of statistics and mathematical biology, having established the principles of correlation and regression to the mean. In 1884, he founded the Anthropometric Laboratory, first at the International Health Exhibition and then at the South Kensington Museum. Its aim was twofold. First, to demonstrate how measuring physical characteristics such as eyesight regularly would help to identify any deficiencies early on, and, second, to collect data for his statistical studies so he could compare attributes across races, occupations, age and birthplace to determine how character, intelligence, aptitude and behavior might vary. During the first year, nearly 10,000 people came to be measured, with thousands more in subsequent years. The amount of data collected by the laboratory was so vast that it wasn't until the 1960s that there were computers capable of dealing with it. The techniques used at the laboratory were seen to have potential for practical social applications. For instance, they directly inspired the first system of forensic anthropometry devised by French policeman Alphonse Bertillon, who would later develop the mugshot. The Bertillon system was specifically aimed at identifying recidivists via 10-key body measurements. Given his laboratory's fame and success, Galton sought the backing of an academic institution, and naturally he chose University College London, UCL, where I now hold a post in computer science. Established in 1826 as the first secular institution of higher education in the UK, UCL was considered the cutting-edge scientific institute of its day and was the only British university that would grant degrees to non-Anglicans. The university's founders and supporters were some of the greatest scientists and philosophers of their time, men who believed the supernaturally based prejudices of religion should have no part in a modern education. It was here that Galton sought support for his anthropometric laboratory, and where, in 1904, the UK Eugenics Records Office was established as a center for capturing biometric, big data. Galton was in his 80s by then, so to carry on his work he requested that his protege Carl Pearson was made a Francis Galton Fellow, and later the Francis Galton Chair, a position Galton endowed at UCL on his death in 1911. Like Galton, Pearson was a prominent liberal of his time, an outspoken freethinker, a lecturer on women's right to vote, and on the theories of Karl Marx, in honor of whom Pearson changed the first letter of his name. His political views encompassed economic conservatism and radical socialism to produce a unique brand of social radicalism. He was also unequivocal that while fair and scientific, the advance of humanity via evolution was not to be gentle under eugenics. Pearson wrote, "My view, and I think it may be called the scientific view of a nation, is that of an organized whole, kept up to a high pitch of internal efficiency by ensuring that its numbers are substantially recruited from the better stocks, and kept up to a high pitch of external efficiency by contest, chiefly by way of war with inferior races." Nor was his rigorous application of social Darwinism solely reserved for other races or weaker members of society. In his 1909 paper The Problem of Practical Eugenics, Pearson even argued that the reform of child labor laws had made children into an economic and social burden to their parents and society. Calling for a repeal of child labor and work laws, he states, "Practical eugenics demands in the first place that the economic value of the child shall be restored to pre-regulation status." When he took over the UK Eugenics Records Office from Galton in 1907, Pearson renamed it the Eugenics Laboratory, which had a more scientific ring, and reflected how the facility's work moved from merely gathering data to creating a new science around data analysis via statistics. Processing the lab's big data required statistical mathematics, so in 1911 Pearson, who already held a chair in applied mathematics at UCL, merged the biometric and eugenics laboratories to form the Department of Applied Statistics, the first university statistics department in the world. Pearson went on to create the Pearson correlation coefficient, one of the most fundamental calculations in statistics. In fact, his work is so foundational to statistics that he was offered a knighthood, which he declined based on his personal commitment to socialism. The UCL building which once housed the Department of Statistics bears his name. Pearson also founded the Annals of Eugenics Journal, which now exists as the Prominent Annals of Genetics, the masthead of which originally included the famous misquote from Charles Darwin. Pearson's focus on advancing eugenics put him amongst the most liberal intellectuals of his time, not only in the UK, but throughout the world. 7 years after the British era was founded, its American equivalent was established by Davenport, who would inspire the civic biology text that Stokes would teach from. At the same time, the Eugenics Education Society was created to include a broader range of intellectuals who supported eugenics as a positive social force. Galton was the first president, and upon his death it was renamed the Galton Institute, a name it still holds today. Prominent members have included economist John Maynard Keynes, who served as the organization's VP in 1937, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, serial inventor John Harvey Kellogg, and Margaret Sanger, an American and the founder of what is now known as Planned Parenthood. The Galton Institute, the Eugenics Records Offices, the UCL Eugenics Laboratory, and other similar bodies existed to propagate the idea that eugenics was a fair and scientific way to advance human development, and was part of an august progression of liberal philosophical ideas, from Godwin's theory of necessity, through the social utopianism of Percy Shelley's Queen Mab, to the belief that the bell curve reflects a natural law of normal distribution, and Darwin's theory. In the eyes of early 20th century intellectuals, the advances in science and mathematics finally provided the means to enact these utopian agendas through the new field of eugenics. Eugenics provided the means of ensuring that Spencer's survival of the fittest became survival of the better. The question is, better how? Implicit in all this reasoning is the idea that humanity, subject as it is to survival of the fittest, has a fitness which must be measurable. In essence, in order to apply the mathematics to the social tasks of eugenics, we have to have something to measure, like the throw of the die in a game of chance. While Cattell implied that physical deviations, like variations in chess measurements, were connected to the moral character of man, Galton made explicit the idea that the complex, human phenomena of intelligence can be viewed as an aggregated, measurable phenomenon, subject to mathematical laws, just like the distances between the stars. Pearson, with his statistical abilities, sought to add mathematical rigor to the matter, using the data gathered in the eugenics laboratory, particularly with regard to quantifying human intelligence. He started much the way Cattell did, by looking at things one could evaluate with a balance scale or a measuring tape. For instance, the brain. Around 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, wrote, "From nothing else but the brain comes joys, delights, laughter and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency and lamentations." By contrast, Aristotle believed the brain was a cooling device, a kind of fleshy radiator, that enabled people to overcome their hot-bloodedness in contrast to animals with smaller brains. By the Renaissance, thanks in large part to Descartes, the brain was seen as a surrogate for the soul, a separate entity divorced from the body where the higher functions of rational thought and moral behaviors resided. Therefore, if scientists were going to find a method to improve mankind, it made sense to start by measuring and gathering statistics on the size of brains. The Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology stands beside the UCL Computer Science Building, which houses my office. It is named for another eugenicist contemporary of Pearson's, Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, 1853-1942, who was a staunch believer in the superiority of the Caucasoid races. He created and propagated the idea that the pharaohs and their kin were not Africans but were instead a race of white people who long ago conquered and ruled over the indigenous people of Egypt, who were assumed to be mulatto. During Petrie's African travels, he collected a huge number of skulls, which he presented to his friend Carl Pearson for biometric examination. At the time, across colonial territories, the collection of native remains and specimens was a widespread and accepted practice, as was the dehumanizing habit of measuring every aspect of living native peoples. The scientists, collectors, and museum curators engaged in this mass act of desecration, graveyard robbery, and humiliating measurement were, for the most part, believers in eugenics who thought the study of different human remains would yield important insights into the evolutionary genealogy of the human species. Pearson added Petrie's African skulls to his collection of local head bones, which he sourced largely from plague pits in England, eventually creating a collection of over 7,000 skeletal human heads. Pearson used these skulls in his work, creating his coefficient of racial likeness, which involved measuring each skull and comparing it to statistics of other skulls. Pearson used these skulls in his work, creating his coefficient of racial likeness, which involved measuring each skull and comparing it to statistics of other skulls, to establish a person's race. This interest in differentiating the so-called races gave birth to craniology, a whole field of science devoted to the study of skulls to determine racial differences. By elaborate measurements of cranial capacity, this new field set out to assess brain size, relative development of different areas of the brain, and thus, it was assumed, intelligence itself. Naturally, it was clear that men as a group had more cranial capacity and, therefore, more intelligence than women, who generally had smaller skulls. And, unsurprisingly, it was soon discovered that on average the cranial capacity of the white race was greater than that of Africans, Asians, and even Southern Europeans. As a popular new science, craniology added impressive new data to support the existing sexual and racial caste system, and reinforced racial segregation and the oppression of women. But there were many illogical inconsistencies in the theory. What was to be done, for example, about whales and elephants, who clearly had larger skulls than Homo sapiens? Should the ratio of brain weight to body weight be taken into account to deal with this inconsistency? But then that would make women more intelligent than men as a group. Or should the ratio of the brain surface to body surface be used? Except that would make men of some other races smarter than Caucasians. Or should the slant of the forehead be taken into account? But, then, what about anteaters? In the end, it was a female mathematician, Alice Lee, who demolished the theory in her paper, A Study of the Correlation of the Human Skull, which was published in 1901. Ironically, Lee worked in the UCL biometrics lab, and she came to work there via a vigorous disagreement with Pearson, the lab's head. In 1892, Pearson wrote an article in the Pall Mall Gazette suggesting the closure of the Bedford College for women. The college, which was within easy walking distance of UCL, where Bloomsbury Publishing now has its offices, was founded in 1849 as the first institution for the education of women in the UK. Pearson suggested its closure not because he felt women should not be educated. On the contrary, Pearson was a strong defender of women's rights. He simply felt that Bedford had a lack of academic standards. Alice Lee, who had graduated from Bedford and taught there, wrote Pearson a spirited letter refuting his assertions. It must have been a good one, as it not only changed his mind, it led him to hire her. As a keen mathematician, Alice developed a clever way to measure the size of the brain within a living skull, based on external measurements and some reliance on the statistic heuristic, thus overcoming the issue of each skull's unique thickness. She filled her dead skulls with sand, poured the sand onto a scale and recorded the weight. She then took other measurements of the same skull's exteriors. Using these measures and some statistical maths, she developed a formula such that external measurements of living skulls could be taken and converted to the equivalent brain volume based in the dead skulls, with statistical validity demonstrated on the UCL collection of skulls. This enabled her to conduct an experiment comparing the brains of female students at Bedford College, male faculty members at UCL, and 39 distinguished anatomists of the Anatomical Society of Dublin. She measured their skulls and used her formula to determine their brain volumes, and then presented the results in a ranked table in order of decreasing skull size, with each entry identified by name. The paper showed irrefutably that the eminent men in the study didn't have unusually large-sized brains at all. So unless they were willing to accept their lower ranking on the table as proof of their lower intelligence, they had to accept that the craniometric theory of intelligence was bogus. Alice Lee's pivotal work demonstrated that gross physical measurements weren't going to provide a quantitative metric for intelligence. Looking back at craniology, it may seem absurd that it was ever considered a respectable field of science, but even today its dehumanizing othering of people of color still casts a long shadow, particularly over indigenous peoples such as the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Re-examining this history provides a useful lesson in how accepted, even popular, theories can turn out to be dramatically wrong. In the end, craniological proofs were found to be enormously biased, carelessly and fraudulently gathered, and largely based on deep-seated culture-bound assumptions. Likewise, forensic anthropometry was enormously error-laden and had dangerous social effects. The related field of criminal anthropology, also known as offender profiling, first devised by physician Cesare Lombroso around the same time as the Bertillon system, which advocated that criminal behavior could be identified by physical defects, was scientific prejudice at its worst. This reminds us that we constantly need to question, test, and re-examine current theories for their scientific validity in case they, too, ultimately turn out to be faulty. While Alice Lee was busy putting the final nail in the coffin of craniology, in France the French Ministry of Education was seeking the help of psychologists.